Let's talk about God's prayer shawl. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 9, it talks about him sitting there, Atik Yomin, and his garment is white as snow, and the hair of his head is like pure wool. Daniel 7, 9. And we find this concept of God having a garment, where it says in Psalms 104, he covers himself with light as a garment. God actually has something on him. And this is very difficult to understand. How could we possibly say that God performs an act like putting on a talit, putting on the prayer shawl? Because we know it's a fundamental principle of Judaism that we realize that God has no body, no shape, or no form. God is in no way physical, and nothing physical can apply to God at all. Zero. And furthermore, to suggest anything physical, like God having a body or wearing a talit in relation to God, would go against the very foundation of our belief. Still, many places in the Torah, we actually see that God speaks as if he has a human body. Countless verses. We find expressions such as the hand of God by Egypt, or the eyes of God. And numerous other parts of the body are mentioned with relation to God. Now, all of these terms would be anthropomorphism, which is the expression where we borrow terms from human experience when speaking of God. Now, it goes without saying, obviously, that all such expressions must be understood allegorically, not literally. Chazal, our sages, teach us that God borrows terms from his creatures to express his relationship to the world. A physical allegory may be used to express a very profound philosophical relationship between God and his creator, between God and man. So, for example, when the Torah, the Bible, speaks of God's hands or speaks of God's hand, it is speaking of his expression of power and of his providence in guiding the world's destiny. He's moving things along. And we're going to get to this. Similarly, when God speaks of God's eyes, what does that mean? Well, it's alluding to the fact that he's aware of everything that happens in the world. So eyes are awareness. And the same would be true in other anthropomorphism, such as the hand and the eye are pretty simple to understand, but there are other ones that may be more difficult. And when we try to understand the full richness of these allegories in our sacred literature, we find ourselves in a much more, I would say, difficult situation. It's not simple. One of the greatest thinkers, the Rambam, Maimonides, states that a full interpretation of these would actually involve some of the deepest mysteries of Judaism. And to be honest, this is an area where many of the greatest sages over the centuries have really delved into explaining and expounding these very deep concepts. So it goes without saying, it's obvious that when our sages teach us that God wears a prayer shawl, they're not simply telling us that he puts on a tallis. They're providing a profound lesson concerning God's relationship to us. So, in speaking of tzitzit, which are the fringes at the end of the four-corner garment, the Bible actually gives a reason for this commandment, and we say this every single day when we say the Shema. It's to remember all of God's commandments. That when we wear tzitzit, we remember. So obviously, the lesson also has something to do with the significance of the commandments. If God's wearing a talis, and the commandments must be significant. In what way are they significant? So let's try to understand this more completely. And in order to do this, we're going to have to take a little diversion, and we'll get back to this. The problem of evil. See, one of the problems that philosophers and thinkers have puzzled over for centuries is the problem of evil. And here goes. If God is all good, then why does he allow evil to exist? Why is it possible for people to harm each other? Why are there such things as wars, October 7th, concentration camps, the war in Ukraine? Why is this? Possibly in a world that's controlled and ruled by God. This is a question that is adequately treated by great sages and teachers. Don't worry. But before we can begin to really delve into their explanations, we will try to first answer an even more basic question than that. And that is, here goes, why did God create the world? Obviously, it would be utterly naive to believe that we could fully answer this question. So we're going to get something, because God is like so high above us that we can no more understand his motives than a fly buzzing around a great mathematician could possibly understand the math that he's doing. God is so high that we cannot even begin to comprehend his purpose. So let's put that aside. But yet we can understand God's reason to the extent that they have been revealed by him in the Torah, in the Bible. So where is this? Well, the account of creation ends with the word in Genesis, God saw everything that he had made, and it was very good. Tov ma'od. That's Genesis 1:31. This and other verses telling us good teach us that God's purpose in creation was to do good. In order to express his love and goodness, God had to create a world. This is essentially what the psalmist, I guess, King David, means when he sings, God is good to all. His love rests over all his works. Psalms 145:9. But since God is infinite and ultimately good, it would stand to reason that he wanted to give good to his creation. He wants hatov l'hativ. It would have to be the highest possible good. So what's the highest possible good? What's the ultimate good? Well, the answer should be perfectly obvious. The ultimate good is God himself. Thus, when God created the world, he created a world to which he could give of himself. But how is that possible? In what way can God give of himself? How can a mere mortal man partake of God? Well, the answer is not so difficult if you really think about it. We can partake in God by resembling him, to be similar to him, to the greatest possible degree. And the more we resemble God, the more we partake of the ultimate good that is God. It is for this reason that God gave man free will, free choice. If a man can't choose, he would be completely the opposite of God. So an angel who can't sin, that's not it. He would be like a robot or a puppet. God, on the other hand, is absolutely free to do as he wills, since There's nothing holding him back. So in giving man free will, God gave him the ability to imitate God and thus ultimately partake of him. Therefore, just as God chooses good as a matter of free will, so can man. But in order for this choice to be real, God had to create the opposite of good. He therefore created the possibility of evil, so that man would be free to choose between good and its opposite, evil. God himself speaks of this when the prophet says, I form light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I am good. I do all these things. Isaiah 45:7, where it says, Ani Hashem says kol eila. Yitzhar baruch choshech. Although evil does not fulfill God's primary purpose in creation, it does fulfill his purpose in a secondary way. In a sense, it's like the peel of a fruit or the shell of a nut. They are in themselves useless, but they serve the secondary purpose of preserving. They preserve the fruit until it's used. Then you peel the orange, then the banana. The same is true with evil. It doesn't serve God's primary purpose of bestowing good, but it does fulfill the secondary purpose of making it possible. Because of this, the forces of evil are often referred to as the husk or the klipa in relation to God's purpose, the shell. God's ultimate purpose, however, is to do good and to bring about a world where all is good. The destiny of evil, ultimately, is to be transformed to good. Slowly but surely, the world must reach a level of perfection and will reach the level of perfection planned by God. Now, regarding providence, the major thing about perfecting everything belongs to man. The psalmist said, the heavens belong to God, but the earth he gave to the sons of man. Tehillim, Psalms 115:16. It's man's responsibility to use his God's given free will for good, and thus bring about a world conforming to God's plan. In doing so, he becomes a partner with God and is able to partake of him in another sense. But providence says God doesn't leave things to chance. There's also the element of divine providence, that God interjects. Although God gave individual free will, everybody can choose, he still influences the macro, the large-scale course of history. Even though he does not determine the conduct of individuals, he's not on each person. The collective will of all the nations and societies are largely determined by God. Hashgacha klalit and hashgacha pratit, macro and micro. This is what the verse says when it says, the king's heart is in God's hand. He turns it however he wills. Proverbs 21. Live melech biyad Elokim. He guides the destiny of the individual to fulfill his purpose. But God interacts with each individual to bring him towards his goal. He thus might place a certain individual in a certain predicament, cause him to meet a certain friend, or otherwise give him an opportunity to act in a way that helps lead the world to God's ultimate goal. In a way, the situation is very much like, I would say, like a game of master chess, a master chess player. Although his opponent has complete free will, he can do whatever he wants. The master knows how to counter each move and thus bring the game to any conclusion he desires. So using this analogy, we could say that God is the ultimate master, and his game involves all mankind. And the stakes are the ultimate triumph of good. All this comes under the general heading of what we call divine providence or hashgacha. And we said there's hashgacha klalit and hashgacha pratit, macro and micro. It's what we mean when we say God is king of the universe. His providence is at constant work guiding the world towards this goal. Now, besides this primary providence, which is the macro, there's a second element of providence that God uses specifically to deal with evil, a separate thing. If you think about it, it's obvious that there are two such secondary elements, actually. It's actually two. First, there's the element of providence that allows evil to exist. Since God's purpose requires the existence of evil, he must, in a sense, hold himself back, that's gebura, from restraint, from utterly destroying it, allowing things to be. Therefore, although God is constantly guiding the world towards good, he's still allowing evil to exist as long as it serves his purpose. It is of this element of providence that Chazal, our sages, speak when they teach us that when one comes to defile himself, God opens the way for him. God helps people. God likes people who repent. Now, the second element of providence regarding evil is what protects evil. Whenever man comes in contact with evil, God must at least give him the power to be able to overcome it. Furthermore, the power that God gives to evil must not be allowed to become part of his providence and thus essentially ruin it. It is this second element of God's providence that our sages speak of when they say that Yitzvah shel Adam is Gabriel of Kol Yom. Man's evil gets stronger every day. And if God didn't help him, he would not be able to overcome it. We therefore see that in order for evil to exist, God must interact with it in two ways. First, he must allow it to continue to exist. And second, he must not allow it to overcome the good. So there's a pull and pull, push and pull. Both of these concepts are alluded to in the beginning of the prophet of Ezekiel's vision. This is amazing. He writes right in the beginning, I looked and behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud and a flashing fire. It was surrounded by a glowing light. It's called a noga. From its midst, from inside of this was the likes of Chashmal. We're going to talk about what Chashmal is, from the midst of the fire. And the midst was the form of 4 chayot. Ezekiel 1:4. Now, these verses are among the most mysterious verses in the entire Torah, Bible. The entire vision of Ezekiel involves such deep concepts. It involves some of the most deepest concepts in the mysticism. We must therefore confine our remarks to the explanation offered by our great commentators and sages, and we're just going to go with the basic understanding. This passage does, however, involve some of topics under discussion. We're actually talking about this, and we'll treat it in that context. Now, Ezekiel begins this account by saying, the heavens were opened, and I saw a vision of God. Ezekiel 1:2. The heavens were open, and I saw a vision of God. He was looking at an allegory of the very topics that we are discussing. In a sense, he was seeing beyond the mere appearances of this world and achieving an understanding of God's purpose and providence that underlies it. The first things that the prophet saw were a stormy wind, a great cloud, and a flashing fire. Now, our sages teach us that these allude to the forces of evil that God allows to exist. These are the forces that separate man from God. And the prophet had to break through them before he could actually see a vision of God. So this is what he had to get past. The next thing that the prophet saw was glowing light, noga in Hebrew. This, the noga, alludes to the elements of God's providence that sustains evil. It is merely a glimmer of God's light, like the afterglow that remains in the sky after the sun has set. While pertaining to night and darkness, it still retains a glimmer of daylight. This is often referred to as glowing husks or klipat noga. Then the prophet, the Navi, describing what he sees, the likes of Chashmal. Now, what is Chashmal? Well, the word Chashmal is virtually untranslatable, even though most English translation render it as electrum, meaning amber. And in modern Hebrew, it is used as the word for electricity. A chashmalai is an electrician. The chashmal actually represents a spiritual force. In fact, it's translated in the Talmud as chash, which means quiet, and mal means to talk. So it is a spiritual thing. And it involves the elements of providence that protects from evil. Thus, the chashmal actually stands as a barrier between good and evil. The final thing after the chashmal that the prophet saw was 4 chayot. Now, the word chayot literally means a living creature. And the reference is to a certain type of angel, particularly associated with God's providence. So it's well to keep the chayot in mind, since we'll return to it later when we're discussing tzitzit in the next episode, and we'll get more into God's garment. But when the Torah uses an anthropomorphism and speaking of God as if he were his man, it's usually making use of a human attribute in the most abstract sense. If we understand what function a certain thing has within a relationship to man, then in the most abstract sense, the same function usually applies to God's relationship to the world. Thus, a man works with his hands. Therefore, when we speak of God's hands, we're referring to his activity. Similarly, a man hears with his ears. So when we speak of God's ears, we're referring to the fact that he listens to our prayers. The same is true of all other anthropomorphisms. If we were to wish to understand what is meant by God's garment, like we started out from Daniel 7:9, we must go back to the discussion in the video on clothing to understand what clothing are to a man. So let's try to take clothing to the most abstract sense. The main function of clothing, of human clothing, is to serve as a barrier against passion. We'll talk about this in a minute. Much evil would result if man's lust passions were left unchecked. And in this respect, this aspect of man's clothing, it provides protection from evil. Taking this in the most abstract manner, we can then say that God's garment is also the force that protects from evil. We can also see this from clothing's secondary function, which is man's apparel also serves to protect him from elements. So if it's cold outside, you put on a coat. We can thus say that clothing serves as protection from a hostile environment. The environment hostile to godliness is again evil. In this sense, also, we can abstract it, say that God's garment is the element of his providence that protects against evil. This would mean, however, that God's garment is identical to the Chashmal that we discussed earlier in Ezekiel 1:4. Both are the elements of his providence that protects from evil. It is therefore not at all surprising that our sages do identify Chashmal with God's garments. And how do they do this? Well, they point out something interesting, that the numerical value of the word Chashmal is the same as Malbush, which is the word for garment. So there's a literal connection between those two concepts of garment and Chashmal. So far, we could understand furthermore with this understanding, we can understand Adam's sin on a somewhat deeper level. And this is what I said we'll get to. When the serpent was tempting Eve, he said, "On the day you eat of it, you shall be like God, knowing good and evil." Genesis 3:5. On its surface, this is a very enigmatic statement. Equally puzzling is the question of how Adam and Eve, who possessed extraordinary intelligence, could have succumbed to the serpent's argument in the first place. How could they even fall? But as we said, the goal of man's creation was that he should strive to imitate God. The serpent therefore argued that God himself was the creator of evil, and therefore he knew good and evil. And if Eve were to eat of the tree of knowledge, she too would know good and evil, and in this way resemble God. So the serpent contended that in doing this, Eve would fulfill God's purpose in creation, since she would then be imitating God. Now, the fallacy of this argument, of course, was that God had specifically commanded man not to partake of the tree. Now, one doesn't fulfill God's purpose by actually doing the exact opposite of what he expressed. Now, this also explains another enigmatic passage at the same account, the same story. After Adam had sinned and was punished, the Torah says, God made leather garments for Adam and his wife, and he clothed them. And God said, "Behold, man has become like one of us." Genesis 3:21-22. Now, this last expression is most difficult to understand. What does God mean when he says, man has become like one of us? This is especially hard to understand in light of the fact that man had just sinned and been punished. So how is he becoming like God? Even more puzzling is the question, what this has to do with the fact that Adam and Eve had just been given clothing. So there is a connection. But God was saying that now that man has sinned and was the subject to evil thoughts, he needed a protection against evil. In this respect, he had become like God, who also wears a garment serving a similar purpose. Here again, however, this resemblance was not a positive one. What God actually wanted was that man resemble God in overcoming evil, not that he should succumb to it and need to be protected against it. So now that we understand this, we could go back and go into another question. Why do we have, people often wonder why we have so many mitzvahs. Why do we have 613 commandments? We have 248 do's, 365 don'ts. Why? Why is it necessary to have so many laws? Isn't it enough for people to have a general idea of what's right and then they adhere to it? There are many people today who would argue that we should do away with laws completely. That said, they say that all that is necessary that people do is just be good and love each other. Just give hugs, be nice. They point out that at times laws can be harsh. Why then did God give us so many laws in the Torah? Well, the answer, my friends, of course, is because there's evil in the world. If men were perfect, then we would need very few mitzvot. If any laws, people would live in total peace with one another without any rules or regulations. And this is indeed true of animals, for the most part, who live in total harmony with other members of their species without any problem. If you have a bunch of dogs, don't come to me. The same was true with Adam before he sinned. He was innocent of any evil and therefore did not need a multitude of rules and laws. All that was required was that he obey one commandment. He had one commandment, not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that one commandment was enough to give him free will, and thus enable him to achieve perfection and a closeness to God. It was only after that man sinned that he needed an entire complex of law. The commandments, therefore, serve as a safeguard against the forces of evil. They restrict man's relationship with his neighbor so that one individual does not harm another. They constantly remind us of our obligation to God, so we don't become swallowed up in evil. We therefore see that, to a large degree, the commandments of the Torah serve to protect us from evil. They are, in this respect, the element of God's plan that serves as, I guess, a barrier against the forces of evil. This is what God meant when he said, I have created the evil urge. Barasi Yetzahara. But I have created the Torah as a remedy. Ava Barasi Torah Tavlan. The Torah and its commandments are the elements in God's scheme that serve as a barrier against evil. But as we have discussed earlier, this is also the concept of God's garment. God's talit, his prayer shawl, is therefore the sum total of all the commandments in the Torah. This is what our sages mean, Chazal, when they say, he who keeps the commandments is as if he grabs the divine presence. This is the meaning of Tzitzit. The commandment of Tzitzit alludes to the 613 commandments. Our sages similarly teach us that commandment of Tzitzit is equal to all other commandments. And we say every day, and you see them, and remember all of God's commandments, and you don't stray after your heart and your eyes. So this commandment of Tzitzit alludes to God's talis, which in turn represents the entire structure of the commandments, standing as a barrier against evil. After Adam sinned, the Torah says they knew that they were naked, and they sewed together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. Now, there's a tradition that what they actually made were tzitzit. Rashi furthermore explains that when the Torah says they knew they were naked, what it actually means is that they were naked of the one commandment that God had given them. And as soon as man sinned, he realized that he would need the entire structure of the commandments alluded to in the mitzvah of tzitzis. As soon as he realized that he was naked of his original, one mitzvah that he had, one commandment, not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he made himself tzitzit, the one commandment that includes all other mitzvot. The Medrash tells us that the first time that God is said to have appeared wearing his prayer shawl, his talit, was when he gave Moses the first commandment, not the 10 commandments, but the first commandment the Jewish people got, the one involving the Jewish calendar. God was beginning to teach Moses the way of the commandments. When he started, he showed Moses the talit that alludes to them all. Now, when we said in Psalms, we started out the talk, we said in Psalms 104, it says, he covers himself with light as a garment. Psalms 104:2. So this here again, this is an allusion to the light of the Torah and its commandments. As we find here, it says in Proverbs 6:23, A commandment is a lamp, and the Torah is a light. Kiner mitzvah, the Torah or. With the start of the recent war on October 7th, there was hundreds of thousands of Jewish soldiers who had never wore tzitzit before. They never wore the fringes. The fringes, I could show you my fringes over here. It's a four-cornered garment. And there were families throughout our neighborhood and synagogues who they have to be strung together, all the strings, and tens of thousands of tzitzis were given out to soldiers. Today in Israel, there are children in secular communities around Israel who grew up not knowing what Shabbat was and still don't cover their head wearing a kippah, but are wearing tzitzit. There are girls who've never lit Shabbos candles before, but now are lighting up the light on Shabbat. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please leave comments, and I will read your comments. Shavua Tov, Chazak v'amatz. Thank you for listening from just outside Jerusalem. Shalom.